Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this NATA webinar with Professor Nicholas Burns of the Harvard Kennedy School. Welcome, Professor Burns, and welcome to all of you who join us today. This is, I think, the 15th or 16th webinar that NATA has hosted during the pandemic crisis, and this is my fifth, I believe. And we welcome you all for making time and joining us at lunchtime today. And thank you all very much. And thanks to the team at NATA, Jay Wagger and Colleen and others for making this work for me and for everybody else. So thank you very much. I've known Professor Burns. I've met him over 20 years ago when I met him through a friend, Nicholas Metropolis, and he spoke at the State House. We had a series at the State House when I worked for Speaker Finneran, and he spoke from the well of the house, from the rostrum, actually. And we've stayed in touch, and he spoke at NATA, I think, 3 years ago. So I was thinking in April about the impact of the coronavirus on U.S. foreign relations. What was the state before, say, March 13th or so, during the crisis, and maybe going forward, what the impact will be, particularly with the presidential election looming here in the United States. So that essentially was the basis of my invitation to Professor Burns to speak with us today. I also I've asked him to talk about the importance of leadership. Digger Donahue, who's on the phone, sent me an article that's in this month's Harvard Magazine that Professor Burns wrote called "The Indispensable Power on Restoring American Leadership Through Diplomacy." And just so you know, tomorrow I'll send each of you who are on the call today a copy of that article. As I mentioned, Digger, I did reach out to him and we talked about what we may talk about today. And Digger raised this question that I'm going to ask Professor Burns. And the topic is resiliency. Resiliency. How does a career diplomat or a career foreign service officer, in your case, over 30 years, how do you deal with the number of administrations and the number of roles that you have served? How do you deal with the different administrations, secretaries of state, folks around the president, and how do you continue to be effective and to handle your responsibilities? I've asked, as Digger and I were talking about this, almost simultaneously, we said to each other, did you read the article in the New Yorker magazine, March 30th, about Dr. Fauci? And we both said to each other, yes. And it's a great article. If you haven't read it, it's a great article. And of course, he's been in that position since Ronald Reagan. And now, of course, since March, and the relationship now is you can interpret as you want to. But Dr. Fauci in this article offers some great advice that I'm going to ask Professor Burns to talk about. He said this: he has developed a method for dealing with political leaders in times of crisis. He said, I go to my favorite book of philosophy, The Godfather, and it says, it's nothing personal, it's strictly business. Do you remember the book? And then he also offers, when you go into the White House, you should be prepared that this is the last time that you ever go in. So, Professor, what do you think of, in your career and your perspective, what do you think of Dr. Fauci's comments, and also now with John Bolton's book, In the Room Where It Happens? What do you think of this?
Well, Bill, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you and all your guests. A lot of the guests, of course, are mutual friends of ours. And I'm glad that Digger Donahue is on the line. I'm glad Sister Janet is, of Emmanuel. And I just couldn't be more delighted to be back with you, Bill.
Thank you.
I think leadership is the leadership deficit is the most important deficit we face in the United States. We've seen good leaders in the pandemic. I would credit our governor, Charlie Baker, with having been a good, solid, reliable, honest leader. I think my wife Libby and I have a house in Westport, and we're right up on the Rhode Island border. So we've been able to watch really the magnificent performance of Governor Gina Raimondo. We've seen leadership from Gavin Newsom, the governor of California. We've also seen, and I'll just have to be frank with this audience, the failure of the federal government in the pandemic, the failure of the president and his administration to be consistent in its advice, to be truthful to the American people, and to basically not take the responsibility now that 41 of our states have an increase in infections. The federal government is acting, the president and vice president, as if they do not have responsibility, that it's only up to the states. So it's all about leadership. And you're right, Bill, that our country needs public servants, our military officers, our CIA officers, our US Foreign Service officers, my brethren, the service that I served in for such a long time. In the federal government, when you take the oath of office, you take it to the Constitution of the United States. I was sworn in during President Reagan's term as a young Foreign Service officer. I did not take an oath to him or to President Clinton. I took it to the Constitution. And Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci, to me, is, I think, the most remarkable public servant that we have produced in the last several decades, given the breadth and length of his experience, the central position he had in the HIV/AIDS crisis, as well as Ebola, as well now as the coronavirus. He epitomizes that trust and commitment to America that public servants have to have. And Bill, I'll just end on this. The attacks on him this week, organized by the White House, by the president, and by the people closest to the president, are scurrilous, and they're really shameful. And I thought Dr. Fauci handled it well. You read the article this morning in the New York Times. He said, let's knock it off. Let's get back to business. Let's all focus on the true crisis. That's the pandemic. I really admire him.
The thing that since I've got to know him as a, on television and his comments, it just seems that we don't realize sometimes that these people are working in government, and he's been there 30-something years, doing tremendous work. He goes, as you said, he goes back to the AIDS crisis, and just an amazing career. And I know people who know him. Father Michael McFarland, the former president of Holy Cross, is on the line today, and I asked him if he knows them, and he told me yes, and how he knows them, and he's just a remarkable guy. And it's not just recent; it goes back to his days in school, and then of course in his service. But the institutional memory that he has and that you had, that must be something that we have to protect and preserve, not destroy, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, obviously, the elections determine our leadership, and that's how it should be. And those people who risk everything to run for office, they call the shots. The president is the senior officer of the government. And all of us in the career service understand that. We understand when we sign up for federal service that we have to be nonpartisan. We have to give 100% effort and loyalty to whichever administration we're in. We have a right to speak up and disagree, and we often do that in the federal government. It can be a bruising place. It can be a place where arguments should take place over public policy, but when the president decides something, then we have to support. That's what civil servants do. Dr. Fauci's done that his entire career. He's never been political. He has not been political in my judgment during the current pandemic, but to be attacked for advising people to wear masks, to be attacked unfairly by the president himself, saying Dr. Fauci was wrong on several occasions, to have the White House prepare a press statement detailing their unhappiness with him. It's really, I think, It's beneath the office of the presidency to act like this. And Dr. Fauci doesn't deserve this treatment, but you can see in the public opinion polls, he's one of the most trusted men or women in America. That's, I think, his best revenge.
Yeah. Are you surprised by the John Bolton book? And I saw several interviews with him. I saw one last week with Margaret Hoover. I woke up early Saturday down the Cape, and I think it was on the Rhode Island PBS station. She was on firing line, and boy, he does not mince any words, calling the president an incompetent to serve. Are you surprised by the candor in his book and his candor publicly about the president and serving in the roles that he has served?
Yeah, Bill, I have been surprised because John Bolton is a lifelong, very conservative Republican who's always been faithful to Republican leaders. I know him quite well. We served together in the Reagan administration, but I knew him better in the George W. Bush administration when I was Undersecretary of State in our senior career position. He was the ambassador to the United Nations. John and I have diametrically opposed views on how the United States should act in the world. And we often disagreed in those days. I'll tell you this, I still have some of the scars from the stab wounds when he stabbed me in the back a couple of times publicly. But I must say, having said that, we had a lot of disagreements inside the government. I feel that he's highly intelligent, highly experienced, and the criticism that he has put forth strikes me as accurate about the president and about the president's the way he's conducted himself in the office. The Economist magazine said about President Trump 2 weeks ago, quote, "A cruel man, bereft of experience and deeply chaotic," unquote. And I think that a lot of the Bolton charges would fall under that umbrella. Someone the president has not been consistent in what he says and what he does about America's position in the world. The president has been far too close to Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, and frankly, he's been far too critical publicly of Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and of Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany. I think that Angela Merkel, in my book, is the most impressive leader in the world today. A true small d Democrat, the leader of the West, a woman of unimpeachable personal integrity in the way that she's conducted herself as Chancellor of Germany now for nearly 16 years. And to find ourselves in a position where the President of the United States spends half of his time castigating the democratic leaders in the world, our allies, and cozying up to the authoritarian leaders, that's a world that Ronald Reagan wouldn't recognize or wouldn't accept, much less John F. Kennedy or Bill Clinton or any other president of the last 70 or 80 years.
Well, during the interview, he talked about Vladimir Putin and so forth. He said he characterized the president as he just wants to hang with the big boys, and that's the crowd he wants to be friends with or be considered with, as opposed to the people who he should be and the ones that you mentioned. So it was a very candid interview, and I'm halfway through the book. I'm halfway through it. So thank you for that. See, in your article, and I am going to use a quote from the article in the Harvard magazine, you do talk about the need for diplomacy, and you say there are many questions about the World Health Organization, about China not being pressed to tell us more about the virus. Can we share the vaccine throughout the world? What about the recession turning into the Great Depression? And you say the answer to these questions will depend in large measure on our ability to work diplomatically across the world in this multi-front struggle. So I want to keep that in mind as you talk about the impact of COVID. But I want to start with a quote that's in the article at the end of the article. And you quote Winston Churchill at a Harvard commencement in 1941, where he received an honorary degree in a speech called The Gift of a Common Tongue. And you say this quote by Winston Churchill: "The price of greatness is responsibility. One cannot rise to be in many ways the leading community in the civilized world without being involved in its problems, without being convulsed by its agonies and inspired by its causes." You then say Churchill's words at Harvard then are as vital and relevant to Americans today. Could you please spend some time? Why did you select that quote? Why do you think that's so important? And how would you apply it to us today?
Well, Bill, thank you. That is a singular event in Harvard's long 4-century history. Churchill came to the United States to see FDR September 1943, right in the middle of the Second World War. But it was a big moment because it was clear by then, after El Alamein, where the British had stopped Rommel outside of Alexandria, Egypt, in the Egyptian desert, after Stalingrad, where the Soviets stopped the German Sixth Army of von Paulus, it was clear the Nazis were going to lose at some point and that the Allies would win. And Churchill went up to Harvard at FDR's urging to receive an honorary degree from President Conant. And it was a big stage and a big moment because we were going to win the war. They were trying to think about how to construct the post-Cold War world, and something else was happening. The British had reigned supreme for about 150 years as the single greatest global power until about September 1943. And by then, because of the huge productive capacity of the American economy, the incredible arsenal of democracy churning out planes and tanks, our private sector working with FDR, supplying the British, the Soviets, the American war machines, we had become the greatest power in the world, the single strongest. Churchill knew it. So I see Churchill talking to the Harvard leadership and deans, 6,000 young American cadets, young men and women leaving college to go into the military, were lined up in Harvard Yard when Churchill spoke. I see Churchill handing off that baton of leadership to that younger generation of Americans, my mom and dad's generation, Bill, your mom and dad's from Massachusetts, and basically challenging them because we had just come through the America First movement of Charles A. Lindbergh in the 1930s and early 40s. The isolationist gene in America's DNA had come out to say, we can just dig a moat around America and not involve ourselves in world affairs. And that's when Churchill made this remarkable statement: the price of greatness is responsibility. If you have great power, then you have a responsibility to engage, to lead, to be involved in the world. That's a message for our time, because we have had a consensus among Democrats and Republicans since the Second World War. Every president of both parties, all the congressional leaders of both parties have said, of course, the United States has to lead. What are we doing now? Well, we've taken ourselves out of the UN Human Rights Council, out of the International Organization of Migration, which governs refugee and immigrant work around the world. We are out of the Iran nuclear deal. We're the only country in the world not in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, the only one, Bill. President Trump took us out of that. We left the World Health Organization, and most of the world depends on the WHO for all of its faults for public health guidance in the middle of the pandemic. And we withdrew our funding, and we were the largest funder. And it's like withdrawing funding for the Boston Fire Department in the middle of a fire. And so the United States is now, here we are in July of 2020, the strongest country in the world, but shrinking, abandoning our leadership positions left and right. The rest of the world sees it. Who's taking advantage? Putin is, by his aggressiveness in Eastern Europe. Xi Jinping, by his new policies to deny human rights in Hong Kong, by his efforts to wage a conflict against India along their 2,300-mile border up in the Himalayas, by his bullying of the Philippines and Malaysia and the South China Sea. The United States is absent. And, you know, Bill and I didn't want to make this a political event today, but I owe it to your audience to say, I'm supporting Joe Biden. I've been an advisor to Vice President Biden on the campaign now for 16 months. He's a leader. He will bring us back to a position of leadership, and I think President Trump abandoned it. And Bill, I guess I'd say in an attempt at bipartisanship, my impression of the senior leadership of the Republican Party in the Senate and House is they want America to lead. They want America to be involved in leading NATO. They don't want us to shut our doors to immigrants and refugees the way we've been doing. I do think there's a bipartisan consensus in the Congress on this. President Trump just doesn't share that opinion.
What do you think the impeachment proceeding had any impact, empowered him further in some way to do these, to drop out of these organizations, to get out of these discussions? I mean, why would someone in leadership who is empowered by being involved in these organizations, why would you take yourself away from the table?
Well, exactly right. I mean, I think President Trump, I mean, try to understand him for a minute. His theory of international affairs is quite clear. He wants the United States to be powerful. That's clear. He wants us to be number one. He says, make America great. Okay. He thinks that our alliances weaken us, that they slow us down, that they bleed us dry of money and energy. And hardly anybody else in his own party agree with that. And I certainly don't agree with it. I was ambassador to NATO on 9/11. I remember 9/11. I remember when I couldn't reach the Pentagon, the White House, and the State Department. They'd all been evacuated, as you remember, Bill, in the immediate hours after the attacks on New York and the Pentagon, because they felt that the White House or Congress was next. And when I couldn't reach my government, Secretary Powell, Secretary Rumsfeld, Condoleezza Rice, the people I reported to, my phone started to ring. And the first person to call me was the Canadian ambassador, David Wright. I've always credited him. He said, have you thought about invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty? Article 5 says, if one of us is attacked, all of us will be deemed to be attacked. We'll all oppose that attack together. We had never had to invoke it during the Cold War because we had always deterred a Soviet attack of Western Europe. And after David called, Ambassador Wright, the Polish ambassador, the German ambassador, Gebhard von Moltke, the French ambassador, Benoit d'Abbeville, the British ambassador called, we're with you. And the next morning, we invoked Article 5. And all those allies went into Afghanistan with us, and all of them are still there. They've suffered more than 1,000 combat deaths. They've been with us. And so I've lived the value of having allies in the world. They're the great power differential between the US and Russia. Russia doesn't have a single ally. We have 29 NATO allies. China has no allies. We have Australia and Japan and South Korea. And now India is a strategic partner, countries that will be with us and stand up for us through thick or thin. So when President Trump castigates the allies, it really it burns me up a little bit, no pun intended. It gets me a little bit exasperated because he doesn't know the reality or appreciate it. That so many of us have lived in both political parties of relying on these allies.
Yeah, it just seems, in life as well, you have to have goodwill. We all live off of that, to have friendships and goodwill and relationships that we live off of, we live with, and to be able to call or for advice or counsel, whatever it might be. It must be a lonely existence there when you have none.
So one of the people I admired a lot, and I admire so many people in my career: James A. Baker, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright, Condi Rice, Colin Powell. I worked for all these people. And George Shultz is another. He's 99 years old. He's still going to work at Stanford University. He's a remarkable man. When I worked for Secretary Shultz, this is now, Bill, 30 years ago, when I was a very young, untested Foreign Service officer, he used to say, we need to tend the diplomatic garden. And I went with him as a very junior person on a 3-week trip to Asia in the summer of 1988, went to 9 countries. There wasn't a crisis happening. There was no war. And we went to the Marshall Islands and the Philippines and Thailand and Japan and China and South Korea. And he kept saying to us on the plane, we're going to all these places. There's no urgent business. We need to pay our respects, be respectful, we tend the garden, we deepen these relationships because there'll come a day when we're going to need them. How wise is that from
Yeah.
Ronald
Well,
Reagan, Secretary of State? I think that's a good message for us now, Bill, because we're making enemies left and right when we cavalierly, the president dismisses Angela Merkel or our great neighbor Justin Trudeau or the Mexican leadership. This is not very wise.
yeah. Well, 2 points. One, I think to a very, very simple principle, the time to develop relationships and develop goodwill is when you don't need them, or when you don't need anything, I should say. How about with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill? I read Chris Matthews' book about the friendship that those guys developed.
It was really remarkable. You're right, Bill, and Chris Matthews was right there to have witnessed it. You know, you reflect on that. You know, President Reagan and Speaker O'Neill were very different people from very different places and ideologies, but they managed to connect personally. And I'd like to think, Bill, maybe you and I, we're both Irish Americans, would like to think that the Irish bond helped. And I think it did actually between the two of them. What's the lesson for us? A long time, 30 years later, the lesson for us is we've got to get over our partisan enmity. We're always going to have differences between liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats, but look at how we're divided now. We're divided north, south, red, blue, liberal, conservative, coastal Americans, interior Americans. The level of distrust in America among the citizens is out of hand. And you do need political leaders in both parties who will appeal, as Lincoln said, to the better angels of our natures. And Ronald Reagan was a uniter, and John F. Kennedy was a uniter. I'm sorry to say that President Trump is a divider. I think Joe Biden is a uniter. You know who else is a uniter? Who's really stood up? Mitt Romney, our former governor of the Commonwealth.
He saw that, yeah.
Stood up several times, from the impeachment trial to denouncing the president's pardoning of Roger Stone, which I thought, frankly, was corrupt. And we need those bipartisan leaders to bring us back together as Americans. We're Americans first and foremost.
If you think about the void that exists due to his lack of leadership, and you mentioned your support and advising of Vice President Biden, could you just describe for us how you think that, and maybe examples, how you think that Joseph Biden fills the need? What is it about him, whether it's intellectually, whether it's empathetic, whatever it might be, how do you think he fills the leadership need that we believe does exist? What is it about him that you think he is the right person at this time?
Yeah, with the country so divided, with the level of animosity so high, experiencing at one time, Bill, think of the crises we're living through as Americans. The pandemic crisis, 135,000 people dead. The economic crisis, highest level of unemployment since 1933. The racial crisis, really the existential crisis in American history is race. We've never gotten it right. We white Americans need to go overboard in trying to connect and be faithful to the aspirations of African Americans to be treated equally, racial justice, racial equality. And then the leadership crisis. I think that Joe Biden is uniquely positioned right now to lead us on all four of these crises. He you know his biography. He comes from the middle class. That's where he was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, a middle class family. So he understands unions. He understands working people. He understands people in the service industries. He understands what it's like not to have a lot of money, or maybe to have a family crisis because his father did lose his job when Vice President Biden was younger. And everyone knows that he's had terrible personal tragedies, losing his
Yeah.
wife, losing his daughter, losing his son, and how he's overcome them. And that has made him, and I'm about the millionth person to say this, but it's so remarkable about him. When you meet him, when you talk to him, when you watch him, he is an empathetic person. He tries to, he gravitates towards people who need a human connection. And that's what leaders do. Leaders don't care about your political party affiliation. They don't care about whether you're African American or Irish American. They know that leaders know that people need to be comforted, they need to be understood, and they need to be supported. I will put on top of this, Bill, he has tremendous experience in my line of work on foreign and defense policy. When I was negotiating the US-India civil nuclear agreement, it was a big landmark agreement between the US and India. This is now in the George W. Bush administration. The single most helpful person to me in the entire Senate was Joe Biden. He was in the opposition party, and I met him many times. We had to have 2 votes of the Senate to take US sanctions off India and to allow to provide for American companies to be able to invest in the civil nuclear power sector in India. And Joe Biden was the one who led and got it done with Republicans and Democrats. I truly think someone who comes from the center of the country and the center of who we are, I think he's the right person right now for us.
If you say in your article the need for diplomacy, there's no greater time than now for diplomacy. And if you were speaking to a career foreign service officer and they said to you, will President Biden be good for the diplomatic corps? You mentioned in your article how the staff is being reduced and so forth. Why do you think Biden is the right person when you say the need for diplomacy is so important? Is he the candidate for the diplomatic activity?
I do. And let me just say, Bill, be quick to say to this group, I'm a strong supporter of our military. We need to remain the strongest military power in the world to protect ourselves and our friends. I'm a strong believer in our intelligence community. You need a highly sophisticated intelligence apparatus to compete and defend the American people in a cyber world where Russia and China and Iran and North Korea are attacking us on a daily basis in cyberspace. But we also, and we've spent a lot of time in the US government over the last 20 years, we've completely rebuilt the military into what it is since Vietnam. We've completely rebuilt the intelligence community since the intelligence failure of Iraq in 2003. We've created the Department of Homeland Security because that was a gap in our defenses that 9/11 exposed. We have not reimagined and rethought and reformed the State Department and our diplomacy. And why is that important? We're going to need those other agencies. But Bill, I think that if we could tick off the 10 most important challenges we face as a human community, 7.7 billion of us in the next 20 years, most of them lend themselves more to diplomacy than the use of military force. How to fight pandemics. This is the 4th pandemic in 17 years. We're going to have another one, likely. It will be a different type in the next 10 years. How to combat climate change. I'm a climate change acceptor, not a denier. We need to join the rest of the world. How to prevent world food and water shortages. It's a real problem in parts of East Africa, South Asia. How to prevent the United States and China from ending up in a catastrophic war. All of those big human challenges are going to lend themselves more to diplomats, to our presidents and secretaries of state acting on our behalf peacefully to form coalitions, to form alliances, to make agreements. And we need to do more of that in the future. So therefore, we've got to have men and women ready to do it. The State Department has been severely weakened. Too many political appointees, not enough career appointees. The budget's very small, doesn't support the mission. Morale's low. The president has called the State Department the deep state. You saw how the Trump administration treated my friends who answered their constitutional oath, Foreign Service officers, in the impeachment inquiry, Ambassador Masha Yovanovitch.
Right.
Ambassador Taylor. George Kent, who grew up in Cambridge, Mass., went to Harvard College and then into the Foreign Service, a close friend of mine. He answered the call and testified, and they were maligned by their own administration because they answered on a nonpartisan basis their constitutional oath. The Senate said, the House said, please testify. We're subpoenaing. We're going to give you subpoenas, and they responded, and they were treated shamefully for it. That's what I worry about, that we've got a weakened, demoralized, dispirited Foreign Service, and we need to build them back up. Joe Biden will definitely do that. He understands diplomacy, and he's a diplomat himself in the way he's conducted himself.
Well, come back to the president for a second as to why he has retreated on so many of those agreements and organizations like the WHO and so forth. Is this just a style that is himself, or is there anybody that he has modeled himself, or is using as an example, or is it just his own nature and his own mindset that this is the way that I'm going to govern?
Yeah, I'm obviously not equipped to really psychoanalyze them.
Yeah.
Not being a psychiatrist or psychologist. His niece, as you know, has just written a book, and she
Yeah.
is a psychologist. I would say that the only thing I'm equipped to say, really, because I've actually never met President Trump, so I can't get into his head. He really, I think he wants the United States to be great. He wants the United States to be successful. I don't think he's trying to harm the country intentionally. But the impact of his policies has been to weaken us. Why? I try to ask myself, Bill, what made us great from the Second World War onward? A lot of things. Our faith in democracy, that we should lead it and support it when it's attacked overseas. John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan. That's number one. Number two, we've been great because we depended on our allies, and we knew we needed friends and allies around the world. That's Eisenhower. That's Truman. They're the ones who established those alliances that served us so well. Third, we've been great because we believed in free trade. And that's every president from Harry Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower down through President Obama of both parties who believe that America does best, our companies do best, when we lower barriers to trade and try to create regional movements and global movements for free trade. And the president is the antithesis of a free trader. He's a protectionist. And then finally, that America has a leadership vocation and mission that we cannot deny because we're the single strongest power in the world. Those are the elements of our greatness. And I say that because the president says he wants to make America great again. We were already great when he ran for office. We were not always effective. We've made a lot of big mistakes in your lifetime and my lifetime, Bill, when we were little kids growing up in the Boston area of Vietnam, Watergate, certainly the Iraq War in 2003, major mistakes. But think of all the good that America did in all those Republican and Democratic administrations. We didn't need the kind of abrupt transformational change to go from leading the world and being engaged in the world as a moral leader, political leader, and military leader, to an absentee leader, to a country that is shrinking away from it and trying to go it alone. I say to my students, look, if you wanted to go it alone in the world, we could have done that in 1820, 200 years ago this year, when the United States was several million people really living in the East Coast of America and not trading much with the rest of the world. We live in 2020, symbiotic global economy. You can't defend the American people if you stay at home. You have to have troops forward deployed in Europe and in East Asia to do that. Our businesses cannot compete unless the government provides a free trade environment from within which they can compete. And so the president, he's really living in his mind in a world that doesn't exist anymore, where America could make every decision, call all the shots. Back in the 50s, when the power differential between us and everybody else was vast, now we've got China right at our heels. We've got the Europeans with a larger economy. We have India in many ways rivaling the United States. We're a partner, but they're a powerful competitor in the tech world, the pharmaceutical world. We need to wake up and understand that we lead best if we will operate best if we're leading and engaged with the rest of the world.
There's I've heard this quote a lot and recently, and I'm not going to have it accurate, but it's another Winston Churchill quote I've been thinking about since you've been talking about, and I'm paraphrasing it really, don't let a good crisis go to waste, or words to that effect, And this seems to be during this pandemic, for us and for the president, it seems to be a time for an opportunity to lead, an opportunity to step forward with our allies and with other countries, not to retreat.
Yes.
Agree with that? I know I didn't state that well, but
I do. We started off talking about the coronavirus pandemic. I think the first reaction, let's remember what all of us were thinking back in the first 2 weeks of March, wherever we were, all of us on this call. Our first reaction was appropriate. It was, how do we defend our families? How do we keep our families safe? How do we keep Cambridge, Mass, or Westport, Mass, or Fall River safe? How do we support our local hospitals, our doctors, nurses, and medical personnel? And that was appropriate. We all kind of looked inward. And that frankly made sense because we had to take care of our own communities first. So I would never have thought that. I don't criticize President Trump for not leading internationally in those first weeks, because we had to make sure we had enough PPE, which we didn't, enough masks. Everybody knows that story. But boy, can we be proud of the Boston and Massachusetts hospitals and of the nurses, doctors, and technicians and personnel who went to work every day. I'm so proud of we have two nieces, and my brother's two daughters are both doctors, one at Children's, one at Boston Medical Center. He is chief of pediatric critical care at Children's. And, just to hear from them, all the stories of heroism and commitment by our doctors and nurses, well, we can be proud of them. Having said that, once it became clear that we were in this for the long haul, the United States had a self-interest in working with other countries on the search for a vaccine, despite the problems. And there were real problems with the WHO in January and February, where they were kind of taken in by the Chinese, and they didn't ask enough tough questions of the Chinese. The WHO is critical for most countries around the world who don't have solid public health systems, who don't have the money, and they rely on the expertise and aid of the WHO. We could have led there. We could have said, look, we'll ask questions, and we'll be very tough-minded about reforming the WHO after the pandemic. But while the fire's raging, we're going to be in there helping everybody. We could have called meetings of the G20 to have India, China, the Europeans, Brazil, Nigeria working together. President Trump didn't do any of that. So I think the verdict is he didn't lead effectively at home, and he didn't lead at all internationally. George W. Bush, during the Great Recession, 2008, his first instinct was, let's get the G20 together and let's cooperate internationally. And that's what President Obama did as well. So we know how to do this. The president's instincts are go it alone. They're not often successful instincts in a complicated, integrated world.
Yeah. Going forward, as far as the coronavirus and the presidential election going forward, with Joseph Biden and President Trump as the candidates, how do you see the issue of the virus and its impacts? How do you see that, I'm going to use the word playing out, going forward in the election as we head towards November?
Well, Bill, a lot of people have been saying, and I agree with this conventional wisdom, that the combination of the pandemic and the economic crisis are the greatest challenges the American people have faced since the Great Depression and World War II. And they're both happening to us simultaneously. And they're unbelievably challenging, especially to poor people, especially to people living on fixed incomes, especially to the middle class. And we're seeing that the impact of both in Boston. Who gets sick? people living in crowded immigrant communities, people living in our nursing homes and veterans homes. And, it's just a shame that we weren't better prepared for this as a society. That's on all of us. It's not just on the president. We've got to prepare for the next pandemic. But I do think these are going to be the defining issues of this campaign. And frankly, did the president meet the test of leadership on the pandemic? No. Did he meet the test of leadership on the racial crisis? The extraordinary outpouring of emotion in our society, largely peaceful protests, the greatest number of people on the streets in American history, according to the New York Times. What has the president done? He's become the last defender of the Confederacy. He's the one who wants to keep up the statues of the Civil War Confederate generals who tried to divide and harm the Union and end the Union. And he's the one who, frankly, I have to say this, he has divided us by race. He's made racist comments. And we need someone who will unite white, Latino, African American, and every other ethnic and religious group in the country. I think that's the challenge. That's going to be in the minds of most voters. They're in my minds as a citizen. I know my wife Libby's focused on these issues well. And you compare Joe Biden to Donald Trump. Joe Biden is a uniter. He's in the right place in all these issues. He wants to heal America. Trump's strategy appears to be politically build up his base and appeal to elements in our society, some of them, not all people voting for Trump, obviously. But when you make racist statements, you're appealing to the dark side of America. And that's not where our leader should be. I think he's unfit for office.
See, people have said to me, and I really agree, on the racial injustice, and you and I have seen in our lifetimes, I talk about Boston with people, going back when I was a teenager, really, 1968. You remember, when Martin Luther King was killed.
Yeah.
The city, Detroit, New York, Boston went up in flames, Yeah. And then in Boston in the 70s with busing and desegregation and the impact of that. And the Globe has written articles this week, as recently as yesterday, about what happened back then. It talks about Carson Beach over in South Boston. And people seem to think, I was talking to a friend the other day, Jim Gallagher, and Jim's from Detroit, about this time, Bill, this time it seems different. This time it seems like we're better equipped to move forward and constructively on this issue. Do you feel that way, or in a short time we'll be back to where we were? Do you have a better sense that we're in a better position to deal with the race issue and the social injustice issues?
Yeah, Bill, I think you're right to bring up the image of 1968. I was only 12, and I grew up in Wellesley, and so I was not in the middle of the city. Obviously, I was in the suburbs. But I had a very enlightened teacher, Mrs. Barton. I remember when Martin Luther King was killed, she announced to our sixth grade class. She said, "We're going to suspend class." She brought a television into our classroom. We're going to watch the funeral of a great man. And it's that kind of leadership in America. Our teachers, our priests and nuns and ministers and rabbis and imams, and it's sometimes our political leaders who appeal to the better part of us. Robert F. Kennedy going into the streets of Indianapolis the night Martin Luther King was killed to say, look, I can't understand your reality as African Americans, but I had a brother killed. That's what he said that night. I feel that, your pain. And we need that kind of leadership now. And I think the silver lining to me as an American is to see the millions of people in the streets protesting peacefully, exercising their constitutional rights to say racial justice. Black lives matter. Bill, as you know, I'm on the Board of Trustees of Boston College. I'm a very proud and loyal BC alum. I was so proud when Father Leahy put out his statement. He actually did two statements. And both statements powerful. His second statement, he said, Black Lives Matter. We all, as white Americans, have to believe in that. He announced a new forum on racial justice that the dean of our law school, Vince Rougeau, is going to lead. And, I think he understood Father Leahy, as did every other leader in our society, corporate leaders, civic leaders. We all have to play our part. And, it's on us, the white Americans, it's on us to prove to African Americans that this time it's not just going to be speeches, but we want to create an America that lets them be full citizens and that achieves the goal of racial harmony. It's Condi Rice, my old boss at the State Department, who I deeply admire. She's one of the many people who say this is our original sin of America. The Constitution got it wrong. African Americans are full human beings, not 3/5 of citizens. Never got it right after the Civil War. It took us 100 years to get to Martin Luther King and LBJ and the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. We're still not a society of racial justice. And this is the greatest challenge in American history. Jill Lepore, Harvard historian, has written a 1-volume history of the United States that I read a year ago called These Truths. And Professor Lepore's major theme is race in America. We never have gotten it right. Ken Burns, no relationship to me, Bill, but a good friend, told me once I think at that point of the 26 or 27 documentary films he had made, he said all but 3 or 4 of them have race as a major component. I was struck by that. He said, think of it: Civil War, baseball, Second World, jazz. African Americans have been at the center of our history, but we've marginalized them. And, white America needs to stand up and support the African American population of this country. The president's not doing it. And, people like Joe Kennedy, I support Joe. I'm supporting him in the Senate race. He's a close friend. Joe Kennedy is a leader on this issue. So is Joe Biden. So is Maura Healey. We got a lot of leaders here who are standing up for the right thing right now.
I naively thought that things, I had Carol Falk last year at the office talk about her book about diversity and inclusion, and I told her a story. I said, to the audience, as a Boston guy, I thought race relations in Boston had become better since I was a young guy in the 60s and in the 70s and so forth. And one day, my wife, Anne Marie, and I were at Castle Island in South Boston having a Coke, and a friend of ours, Marie St. Fleur, who was a Haitian woman, who was a good friend of ours, came and she sat down with us. And we're talking about Castle Island. And I said to her, when I was a boy, my mother brought me out here all the time. Did you come out here as a kid? And of course, she laughed and said, Bill, we weren't allowed out here. And we had a good laugh about it. But then I said, if you went down to Carson Beach tonight, you would see a great amount of diversity. I thought things had improved, and maybe I was naive about that. I recommend to the folks on the phone, Detroit, 1968, A City on Fire. It's about the race riots in Detroit during the World Series in Detroit that year. A great, great documentary by HBO, Professor. If you haven't seen it, just remarkable about what happened to that city and why and how it's trying to rebound now. But it's a lot of complicated issues, and I guess I'm going to end in this way for you. I mean, I've asked this question to a lot of speakers, and that is, as you sit back now and you think of your life and what you do and what you think about, do you have hope? Are you hopeful? Are you hopeful about how things after we get a handle on this crisis, if we get a vaccine, hopefully, and you think about your own grandchildren and so forth, do you have hope about where we're going and where we're going to be?
I do. What a wonderful question to end on, Bill, and thank you, because I'm afraid I've thoroughly depressed your audience today, and I apologize for that.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't.
Yes, we human beings need to have hope. And you think of our greatest leaders, Lincoln, FDR, Martin Luther King, they all gave us hope that we could be better than we might think we can be. And as a Catholic, obviously, I believe deeply in the social gospel and in redemption. We're all flawed. We all make mistakes. We all sin, but we can be better. So there's that element. And Bill, I'll end on this. I teach a course at Harvard called Great Powers, and we look at the great power relationships and the great global contest for power between China and the US, Russia, Europe, India, Brazil, Nigeria. And the course is about conflict and about challenges and disagreements. And at the end of every semester, we spend an entire class, and I say to the students ahead of time, tell me what you're hopeful about. Where are the big analytical, hopeful trend lines that we can push forward together on as a global community? And in the May poll, just from a couple of months ago, here's what my students said. Number one, they're very hopeful about poverty alleviation. About 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty in the last 40 years, the greatest number of people to come from poverty to the middle class in human history. And that's the great wealth revolution in China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, Brazil. Number two, despite the pandemic, we are about 3 to 4 years away from eradicating polio, which was a scourge around the world in the 1950s. My mom was a polio victim in Boston, Massachusetts in 1949. Millions of Americans were. It only exists in 3 countries now. We can eradicate it. Bill Gates thinks that we can eradicate malaria in the next 10 to 20 years. And last year alone, 500,000 young kids died in Africa alone of malaria. HIV, AIDS, it was a mortal illness 30 years ago. It's now, because of the presence of retroviral drugs, it's now a chronic illness that can be treated. Third, the rise of women. Not happening everywhere, not happening fast enough. I'm sure the women on this call are shaking their heads at some guy saying that the rise of women is a hopeful trend, but I think it is. The young women in my class from all over the world say they admire what Europe has done, that women are coming to the fore of leadership. Some of the people on this call, including the president of Emmanuel College, female, are leading us forward. And we men need to support that. And fourth, my students feel that technology can achieve a better world. They say things to me in class that are remarkable. They'll say, we should be able to cure most forms of cancer by 2050. We can create a carbon-free world by 2050. The Democratic platform says we should do that, try to do that by 2035. So there's hope. There are hopeful things happening in the world. We need to pull together as Americans and around the world to push forward on these positive trend lines. And I'm glad, Bill, we're ending on that note.
Yeah. If you were to recommend one book on leadership, we started with that topic, leadership. But I did read your recommendation, Professor Vapore's book, her 1 volume. I did read that, and I do read her work in the New Yorker. If there was a book on leadership, I know it's off the top of your head, but is there one book that you might say, would be important to read today? I do like to read that genre of book. Is there anything?
I would say 3. I would say the Taylor Branch biography of Martin Luther King in 3 volumes. I think Martin Luther King's the greatest American of the last century. I think he's a remarkable figure. That gives us hope. I would say Colin Powell's autobiography from 1995, which is so inspiring, son of immigrants. Rose to be our senior military officer, then Secretary of State. And a recent book by Jim Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense, called Call Sign Chaos. It's about his 41 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, and it's all about leadership and about how we need to trust people, we need to build up teams, we need to be loyal to our people. And I'll end on this, another hopeful quote, Bill. Secretary Mattis and I have been talking together publicly. We've been doing seminars like this, events like this together. We did one just earlier this week. He has a remarkably great way of talking about America. He says America has 2 great strengths in the world. Number one is the power of intimidation. He said, that's me, the US military. He said, but we have a second and greater power, the power of inspiration. And that's our Constitution, Bill of Rights, that's our immigrant society. And General Mattis says, that's the greater power. And we really need to work in showing the world and ourselves that power of inspiration again. Boy, that gives me hope when I hear him say that. I hope it gives other people on this call.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. Listen, we reached the hour. I want to thank everybody that's on the call today. Thank you for supporting my webinars and my breakfast and lunches. And again, Professor Burns, thank you so much for your kindness, your friendship to me, and for sharing your views and experience today. Thank you all. Bye now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Talk to you soon, okay?
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks. Be well. See ya. Bye, everybody. Thank you all. Thanks. We'll just